All right. So we are going to be talking about what we're doing right now here at Emory, redeveloping and re-ingesting an institutional repository with Samvera and Fedora 6. I'm Emily Porter, and I'm the Digital Repository Program Manager at Emory, primarily working with our Samvera-based repository applications. And Brad, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Brad Watson. I am a software developer here with Emory University Libraries.
So today, what we're going to talk about is essentially what we're working on. We're in the middle of this. Give a little bit of overview and background context. Um, we're also really probably going to focus more on how we use Fedora as our preservation system. So focusing more on the backend preservation features as opposed to some of the nifty front end features that we get from Samvera products. We'll also, again, talk about lessons that we're learning along the way. And we also wanted to just call out a few things about features, both in the Samvera and Hyrax world, as well as in Fedora. So we'll start out here again with some overview and context. First, just to give an overview. I'm glad we're not the only ones who still are managing repositories that, you know, go back to Fedora 3. I think our original Fedora 3 implementation goes back to maybe about 2008. So we have multiple, as we call them, legacy applications. This is a local uh, Python and Django framework. Um, with multiple content models. We think we have about 300,000 distinct intellectual objects in that infrastructure. Um, Unfortunately, quantifying what's there is a little difficult, um, which I won't get into, but we know that we have a lot of critical data there that we want to bring forward. As part of our kind of repository strategy over time, we adopted the Samvera framework in 2014. We currently have two Samvera applications running on top of a Fedora 4 instance, estimate about 55,000 intellectual objects. We're now out to about 1.8 million files there. And what we'll be talking about today really has to do with us trying to work toward Fedora 6. So we're building a brand new Samvera application using Hyrax, which is in active development right now. So I just wanted to mention we presented last year about a pilot that we did in 2023, um, in which we first kind of kicked the tires on how do we get things from Fedora 3 to Fedora 6. And one of the things that we did was, the first thing we tried was to use the Fedora 3 to 6 direct migration utility. We then essentially loaded the data and then tried to transform it in a way that we could read and write data through a Samvera Hyrax application. So what our major findings were from doing that pilot, which I'm very grateful that we were able to do. At the time, Samvera support for Fedora 6 was still quite experimental. Um, Samvera and Valkyrie, which I know Heather Greer Klein just mentioned recently, was kind of a new middleware layer to interact with Fedora 6 or, you know, a non-Fedora storage environment. That was still also in active development. Um, So we did find that using the 3 to 6 migration tool worked really well, but transforming that data into what the Hyrax data model requires was challenging. And we'll talk a little bit about that data model in our presentation later. But if anyone's interested, we'll provide a link to what we did, what we saw in our presentation last year. So what we're doing right now, we're again, as I mentioned earlier, we're building a brand new application using Hyrax version 5 with Valkyrie and using its Fedora 6 adapter. So meaning we have a Samvera application backed by Fedora 6. And instead of using that direct 3 to 6 migration option, we used the uh, I guess kind of I think this has been around for quite a while, but it's the Fedora 3 import export utility. And then we're exporting those Fedora 3 data streams to a temporary staging area. We've then built a custom extraction and transformation tool. So again, pulling data from a lot of XML files, repackaging them into a CSV file, including the CSV, the paths to the files in that staging area. And then we're using a Samvera tool called bulk racks, which is a bulk import. It also has export capabilities, but a bulk ingest tool, which allows us to perform bulk imports through that CSV file that I was just describing. Bring that into Fedora 6. We're also primarily starting with one collection's full content. And in this case, and a lot of the examples we'll show throughout this session refer to a collection which is open access primarily faculty publications, so things like journal articles, presentations, conference papers, that sort of thing. This is about 32,000 of those and about 300,000 files. We're also working on creating and or recreating the new application's feature set within Hyrax. And so again, some other things we're doing relate to making sure we have an equivalent mediated self-deposit service and approval workflow and that sort of thing. We're also doing work to ensure that what, deeper down within our team, we support preservation, so long-term access, and that gets into the data model and services kind of under the hood that we provide related to these types of collections and content. And as Heather mentioned earlier, we're part of the Samvera community effort to support Fedora 6 with Hyrax. So Brad, I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to chime in on that.
Not with this one, but I'll
Okay.
definitely go ahead and take the next one if you like.
Okay. Sure.
Um, cool. So we have been working with Hyrax version 5, 0.0.1, which is the brand new version that is compliant with Fedora 6. We've been using that, which is basically a Ruby on Rails engine built on top of a Ruby on Rails application. We are, of course, using Fedora for both storage and preservation and Solar, the basic application with Hyrax, which includes everything, including the brand new Valkyrie Fedora 6, which is first which is a adapter. Valkyrie is a application that I'm sorry, kind of like a side application that allows multiple types of storage to occur, including Postgres. We are currently as far as we know, the first doing Fedora 6. We are also utilizing the Fits servlet, which is also new kind of to the Hyrax application. It speeds things up quite a bit. Basically, instead of a standalone roll up of fits itself, the servlet is always available and always ready to characterize. We are still using Postgres, which is a little bit of a difference from our previous Hyraxes, I believe, but we're using MySQL for the older ones. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And um, we do have other dependencies, which include the thumbnail generation and background job management, which is kind of par for the course for a Hyrax. We're doing this within basically AWS. We have S3, you know, basically buckets that go ahead and take care of most of our storage needs, and have EC2s that we are playing with at the moment.
Yeah. So we just wanted to give some overview there. I know some of these components are probably similar to what other folks have already mentioned, but we are doing this in AWS. We are doing this with S3, that sort of thing. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about what we're learning along the way. Um, Brad, do you want to take this next one?
Sure, absolutely. So the fun things that we have seen using the Fedora 3 export tool, which is of course a part of the API kind of client side of things, on the older tool that's been around for a bit, we are seeing that basically all the XMLs can be directly downloaded. That's fine. But there is a portion, the audit, portion of the data streams that this basically comes in as text, and we have to scrape that as text until our our storage area. And the only other kind of things that we are seeing is that we are seeing a variety of binary naming. So in some cases we have the full file name with extension, and that's quite easy to play with. In other situations, we see it labeled as content, and also we have other situations that we just see a hash value. In all of those cases where it's content or the hash value, we have to play around and make sure that mine types are true, and there and for enable for us to go ahead and wrap that properly. We have come into one situation where the mine type was either defaulted or empty, and that's whenever we know that we have to manually remediate in that situation.
Yeah. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the data model um, within a Samvera Hyrax application, and also with the transition to Valkyrie. And there's some challenging math here. Um, and this is also incomplete. This isn't representing everything. It's also not showing kind of how and where the various relationships are stored. Um, but I think we just wanted to show this for a couple of reasons. One, um, to kind of get back to what we were saying about our 2023 pilot, the um, taking a Fedora 3 to Fedora 6 direct migration and that data model, and then trying to kind of retransform it to populate all these things which are now required. And in this slide, um, the things that are in bold are kind of minimal data elements that are required um, for the particular, just for baseline kind of uh, population of a given intellectual object. Um, but there's also a lot more to it. So what we're showing in this slide and then the next slide really has to do with starting out from like a clean slate repository with nothing in it. Um, and then looking at a single intellectual object, like for example, a faculty publication that has a single PDF file attached. And these are some of the other things that come into play. Um, Brad, did you want to speak to this one again a little more?
Sure. As you'll see here, some a little bit oddities in the situation. One that we kind of called out upon ourselves, noting that whenever you save a file set with one file attached, the file lives underneath the file metadata object itself. We've also seen that a thumbnail is also a given whenever derivatives are generated. But that doesn't seem to be stored in the Fedora side of things. It seems to be stored on the application side of things within, of course, within storage. And the same goes for extracted text, which we were kind of surprised was actually being created. Um, as far as I can tell, this could be an addition coming from um, a lot of the Haiku Consortia contributions recently, and that also is stored on um, the the application side of things. Um, I'll hand that back to you.
Yeah, I was going to say, I kept kind of changing this number about minimum of 8 Fedora resources to take out the admin set and the access control, but certain entities always receive an access control. But given that this admin set, for example, is only persisted once and its access control only is persisted once, all that to say, there's still a lot of stuff happening here. And it's also important to note, as I know has been mentioned earlier in this conference and also in Fedora discussions, every single one of these things is likely to, or, if it's populated, will become its own distinct OCFL object and its own distinct Fedora resource. So once we start to scale that out, um, we're going to see quite a bit of population here. Um, Now we would like to show some of our additions to that kind of very basic minimal Hyrax Valkyrie data model. Again, as it is persisted to Fedora from what we're seeing. Um, in our case, we have this admin set, which is a very special kind of internal type of collection that controls certain permissions. We also have a collection, which is kind of its own intellectual object and is discoverable. Then we start to see the access controls scaling up. Again, we're using the same example of a single intellectual object with a single PDF attached, all the types of things that get created here. Um, I'll call out a few things briefly here, and then I can show some examples of them. One thing that we're very happy about with the transition to Valkyrie, we do have some new options to do things like, um, again, given that we're going from XML into RDF, um, controlling the order of, the original publication order of authors in a publication. We've figured out how to do that. These get created as basically like nested resources. They are not their own kind of distinct objects, but they kind of are. It's a little hard to describe. Um, we also have added our own preservation um, data entities. So we have a preservation event We have preservation workflows, which are metadata entries associated with certain things that are happening. And right now we're just showing things related to the ingest process. We're also kicking the tires on trying to use our own um, persistent identifier scheme. There are some complications in the current state of Hyrax and Fedora 6 with how that's working, but you can already see the kind of minimum projected estimate for a single work within our data model is already starting to scale up significantly. So moving on to the next slide. So here's a quick example of what one of our preservation event entities looks like. So these are kind of very loosely based on standards like premise and the Library of Congress preservation events, but it's our local way of trying to keep an audit trail. Um, these are, I think maybe one of the more important things is that we are persisting these. We also index them in Solr, and we are able to display these in the front end of our applications. So a preservation manager can come in, log into our application, and really kind of see that history of what's happened, what the outcome was, who did it, start and end time, what software was used for that to happen. Another thing, um, I'm keeping my eye on the time because we're already running a little short, but right now, this is something that we weren't quite expecting, but for us to be able to, compared to Hyrax with Fedora 4, we're able to set our own local identifier scheme. And that, once a given thing is persisted, receives an ID from that scheme. But what we're seeing right now is that a whole separate Fedora object is being created. And you may not be able to see this from my screenshot very well, but the separate parallel object is created, which references back to the object that was persisted. And there seems to be kind of a hard default going to UUID. So that's something that we really want to look at, mainly because we're worried about performance and scale. The other thing I wanted to show really quickly that we mentioned was being able to preserve the original order of author entries. Um, we've also split that out a little more, and we're storing not just simply a single name, but we're able to structure that as first name, last name, institution, and optionally an ORCID identifier. And you kind of see here how with this URI I'm showing, this identifier is for the parent work, and then there's kind of this nested child object that has a little information that's storing those attributes as well as the ordering for that entry. So our next slide is talking a little bit about pear tree, and that's been kind of a stumbling block for us. I think originally we really wanted to make sure that pear tree was supported because that was a best practice in Samvera with active Fedora and Fedora 4. And so that kind of pear tree behavior kicked in right away once something got into Fedora. Um, so Brad, I'll keep talking and let you chime in. But essentially, we've really wrestled with this quite a bit. Um, when we started our project and our migration, one thing we found was that we ran into some issues once we tried to enable pear tree. We've been working with um, Samvera community about this, and it wasn't fully supported at the time that we started this it's getting closer, and I think we've made some breakthroughs there. Another thing, just I mentioned um, to the Fedora team, I know that you all have helped me with this. I had to kind of do some decoding to figure out um, how to get the SHA-256 hash, which then becomes the OCFL path, which is then pair treed to kind of go look at the OCFL that was being persisted um, into our storage route, which in our case is S3. So I'll just mention this really briefly. Um, but I know there's a kind of a feature request in progress, and it's probably my bad for not having had time to test it yet. But we are trying to get this added to the Fedora HTML UI so that um, you don't have to bust out your calculator or whatever to thanks, Aaron. Yeah, Aaron's saying that's going to be added to the 6.5 release. Yeah, so that's great. So there is a certain pattern that you need to know to use if you want to go look at your things in storage, which I absolutely love. But right now at Emory, we're considering not using Pear Tree from the Hyrax Valkyrie side, and instead relying solely on what Fedora and OCFL are already doing. And again, all of this ties into performance, knowing that that has historically been a best practice, and knowing that's a reason why OCFL itself implements that. So just really quickly, I'll show kind of what I was talking about. Once you calculate the hash, you can kind of, in my case, I can go into S3, navigate to the bucket, drill down through the path. I can see the OCFL object in storage, which makes me really happy so that I can validate, yes, things are working. I can go find the thing that I'm looking for. Um, so Brad, I know we're really short on time, but do you want to talk a little bit about our
Sure. So on my local machine, I gave non-pair tree a try, just to write up a real quick script to go ahead and do 100,000 works with each one file attached to it, very small amounts. It took just about 4 days, about 2 days in bulk racks import time, and then 2 more days for the rest of the I'm sorry, the background jobs to complete. Just go ahead and give a heads up. That was one sidekick job per moment. Then that was the out of box behavior. But it is still ingested faster than we are used to. Was a good sign. We have since then, in our application that we've been developing, done a import of 59 works with 468 files dispersed amongst the whole amount of works themselves. That took, as far as bulk racks is concerned, about 15 minutes, but overall about an hour or two with the bulk racks background jobs firing off. And that is also kind of complicated because we were having issues with Fitz servlet responding correctly. So we have since like tuned in the amount of sidekick jobs that should operate at one time so that we do not receive LDP HTTP errors. It seems that we can overload Fedora at a given time if we send too many requests for persistence. And so in that situation, we have found our sweet spot at the moment, but we are definitely open to hearing how we can optimize um, more threads to go ahead and persist at one time if that's a possibility. But yeah, otherwise the details, the further details are right there for you.
Yeah, and I really apologize, everyone. We've been working on this like very recently. We didn't get through all of our slides today, but we'll definitely share them. I would certainly love to, uh, Emily, no, we haven't done the Fedora 6 or 4 to 6 migration yet. Yeah, but we would love to talk to everyone. Um, a lot of the rest of what we had in our slide deck is, just additional information, but we'd love to hear from you. Brad and I are both in the Fedora Slack and Samvera Slack, and we'll be sharing our slides and our email addresses.